To welcome you to this celebration and discussion of Eran Dorfman's fascinating new book called Double Trouble, which is a tongue twister. The Doppelgänger from Romanticism to Modernism, which is hot off the press with Routledge this year. My name is Maya Barzilai. I teach Hebrew literature and comparative Jewish culture at the University of Michigan. I've published 2 books on golems in 20th century cinema, literature, and art, so I can attest to the trouble that the golem as double has caused thus far. And I'll talk about my background in a few minutes. Today, we are fortunate to gather here, although mediated through Zoom, to hear from 4 speakers across the United States, as well as from the author in Israel. Unfortunately, Amir Eshel unexpectedly could not make it today, but we are also fortunate that Marina Mayorski has agreed to step in and will say a few words about the process of working on this book with Eran. And at the end, we'll give Eran an opportunity also to talk and respond. So I'll just be brief and say my opening remarks, and then I'll introduce the speakers each in turn. So with this book, Eran Dorfman has achieved something very rare to my mind, a scholarly volume that is just as intellectually stimulating as it is emotionally gripping. Eran's willingness to take risks, to narrate, for instance, the death of his father or the breakdown of his first relationship, makes this book both compelling and urgent. At points, I was moved to tears, and this does not happen to me often when reading academic literature. At other points, I was brought to reflect upon my own life and the world we live in. Eran's form and style of writing resembles the function of breathing itself. He manages to connect the inside and outside. His narration and intellectual analysis interweave reader and text, reader and author, allowing me to identify with the other's experiences and texts as though I were looking into a penetrating mirror. The thrilling and at times scary ride that this book took me on made me wonder how I would have received this book at any other time and place. We all suffer these days from forms of isolation that have also resensitized us to our relationships with others and with ourselves. We live in the presence of death more than ever before. Significantly, this deadly virus that has been just ravaging societies across the globe attacks the lungs, denaturalizing the process of breathing that is so central to this book. The narcissism of our presidents and prime ministers, their unwillingness at times to acknowledge this invisible but real threat, to lead us through death. So this narcissism has weakened our societies and selves. Furthermore, it is not a coincidence that during the pandemic, American police brutality and systemic racism has reared its ugly head, leading to a mass protest against the murders, also by choking, of citizens who have been treated as undesirable shadows. When reading Double Trouble, I often had this uncanny sense that Eran was writing about these exact events, as though his words were aimed at the future and not just the past and present of the moment of his own writing. What would it mean in 2020 America, I asked myself, and I'm quoting Eran, to no longer negate alterity, but rather manage to access and welcome it, end quote. Or how might a collective entity admit that it is a double of another, connected to another collective through the lives of individuals? And again, this question is paraphrasing Eran's words. Eran poses these poignant questions, but he also, and this is rare in my mind too, answers them. What I admire most about this book is that he gives us a multiplicity of answers to the double problem, not one answer that pretends to fit all cases. And I'd like to spend just a couple more minutes thinking about the technologies that constitute doubles, hence my background. The German actor Paul Wegener, who you see here, played the golem in 3 silent films between 1914 and 1920. But he started out his career enacting the student from Prague in a 1913 film discussed by Eran in this book about a student who sells his mirror image only to be haunted by it and led to self-murder. The cinematic effect of doubling achieved through double exposure on the same film negative, invoke discussions at the time period of how the film medium operates differently from other media. Film captures likenesses of living bodies while also projecting them, using a source of light to create a play of shadows. As one critic, Willie Haas, wrote about the 1913 film, quote, "The problem of the double is the truly demonic, truly spiritual film problem, the film problem of all film problems," end quote. And this was in 1922 that he was saying these words. Wegener, the filmmaker and actor, was obsessed with this particular problem and focused his filmmaking on special effects of splitting images, mirroring, double exposure, and, in the case of the golem, animation. The golem is pure body or matter without soul and speech. It is made to be controlled by the human until it rebels. In cinema, the problem of the golem's animation was solved by creating a replica of the actor, a lifeless golem puppet that was then replaced by the live actor to suggest it had been magically animated. In 1920, such transitions were not seamless. Still, the horror film came into its own at the sight of the golem as double, and it inspired so many films that came after, including Frankenstein and others. So what I want to ask Eran to end my introduction is, how is the narration of doubles different from their visualization in film or photography? Do these media and technologies alter something about the essence of the double? And also, can you speak to the Jeff Wall photograph that beautifully decorates your cover and tell us more about how it came to be put there? So those are my introductory words, and I'll now introduce our first speaker. Paul North teaches literature and critical theory at Yale University. He has written 4 books: The Problem of Distraction from Stanford in 2012, which about the benefits of not thinking, which I need to read urgently. The Yield, Kafka's Etiological Reformation, also from Stanford in 2015, about how not to use power. Bizarre Privileged Items in the Universe, The Logic of Likeness, from Zone. It's going to come out, I guess, in, oh, sorry, I don't have the date here. So from Zone Books. It's about the cosmos where there are no beings and no being, only likenesses. And The Standpoint of Marx's Capital, which is a book in progress, a new interpretation of Marx. He is also the co-editor of a new English critical edition of Marx's Capital, Volume 1, coming out with Princeton University Press in 2022. And I'll now pass it on to Paul North. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Coming through? Good. Well, thank you so much to Eran for the invitation and for the invitation to read the book again. I'm going to read my what I think is a provocation or a gesture, and I'm hoping that you respond to it. So I'll just read it. I'm calling this text of my response trouble. 2 minus 1 is 1. I'm going to make a few reflections for which I have to thank Eran Dorfman, but for which you should not blame him. I read his book before it was published, and it has been working its way through my thoughts since then. So I'm grateful for a chance to formulate some thoughts, for which, as I say, I have him to thank, and you have me to blame. 2 minus 1 is 1. I want to propose this as a formula that became the secret pattern for a major genre in critical writing, which in my mind includes philosophy, psychoanalysis, and some literature too, along with literary criticism, of course. 2 minus 1 is 1 is a pattern or inner rule that I think Double Trouble exposes and tries to put to rest. This is really the provocation. I think this is the end of doubles, this book, so we'll see how Eran responds to this. To be honest, I don't know why since 1781 there are doubles everywhere, and before 1781 they are scarce. Is this significant? Is it true? Dorfman is not the first to think so. His is, I'm proposing, the end of a project, not the beginning. As such, I learned from his book something profound. We need not see the age of doubles as a natural fact, but it can't be avoided as a cultural truth. A certain culture, a set of discourses, reflecting on itself, looks out and sees doubles. We can list the perpetrators, almost all from the 19th century or in its shadow: de Maupassant, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Freud, Nabokov. In this book, they all get together. And it turns out the rumor is true. There has been a fixation on doubles. Here are the texts and passages to prove it. Why, suddenly, after the Sattelzeit, as sometimes it's called, so much repetition of this figure? Why does it provoke so much angst? Why make it the center of a discourse if it doesn't make you comfortable in your culture? I set my watch by the first edition of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason as a heuristic. That was one articulation of the problem, which I'm calling, how can a self be one? It's a deeply technical articulation, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, but one that is early and passionately open about the fact that the problem is a problem, that the self is not one, but should or must be. Regardless of the technical arguments, which we can get into, the Critique of Pure Reason is a megaphone shouting this cultural truth down the 19th century. You should be one, you are not, this is a problem. The problem runs through Descartes too, it's true, but for whatever reason, he can't count to two. He stubbornly insists that two is not subject to negotiation. No operations, mathematical or critical, can be performed on it. Having all the discourses, all the important instances of doubles resounding in our ears in this book gives an impression that I think was never before possible. With the whole gestalt there, a marginal theme can be heard. It isn't in all the case studies, but it is in the sweep of the book, and it also appears at decisive moments, a few of which I will mention. It is legible in the title, first of all. Double Trouble says several things to me. First, it says that the 19th century individual was plagued by the fantasy that it wasn't alone enough. Second, that this caused a difficulty or distortion in self-perception that was not only theorized by psychoanalysis, but probably gave rise to psychoanalysis as another megaphone and potential response. Third, that, as I say, it troubled culture in the sense that culture's dreams now repeated this scene again and again. And fourth, that it isn't a bare natural fact that this happened to selves, to philosophy, to the modes of self-representation of a century in several languages. And fifth, it put the status of these discourses into a bind. The last one interests me, and I've been thinking about it since I first read the book. The book isn't called Doubles in Recent History or even the figure of the double. Trouble is a very precise term, a technical term, maybe on par with Kant's terms, that I would argue is in the theoretical lexicon that this book starts to compile. Trouble is turbulent, and what's more, it's turbid. Its waters are murky waters, getrübt, as you would say in German, a word that Kafka liked. Getrübt by a sediment that won't settle. In trouble, it's hard to pick out perpetrators and victims, or the outlines of a problem. Turning to the book, here is an example of a moment in which the critical voice changes the critical tune from anxiety over the double and its drama to something else. We're introduced to a figure who wants to double up but is not able to. The double fails to emerge, and so the self that depends on it can't itself emerge into the pitched battle that would have sustained it. In the chapter called, quote, The Double's Lesson of Love, unquote, at one moment, Kierkegaard's repetition, along with his dissertation on irony, are the topic. In neither one, Dorfman concludes, does Kierkegaard invest in a true double. He's a fitting antecedent to Dorfman in that. Here, there is double trouble in the other sense, that the double problematic doesn't take hold. Dorfman writes, quote, irony and repetition require a fixed point from which to ascend, a main chute, both solid and fluid, that allows self-transcendence without losing oneself. But who is capable of this task? Question mark, end quote. I'll rest my whole case on this one quote, but there are other moments where a critical instrument is tuned that I'm not sure has been played before, at least not with regard to the fait accompli, the fixation on doubles, and their pesky proliferation in culture. The character who should get his double but doesn't, and the character himself remarks on that. A first reflection of a self who has no hope of doubling, and by doubling, no hope, and by doubling to become himself. It's something like an anti-reflection. I'll read the critic's voice once again. This is Dorfman, quote, "Irony and repetition require a fixed point from which to ascend, a main chute, both solid and fluid, that allows self-transcendence without losing oneself. But who is capable of this task?" That's on page 112, in case you want to look at it. He has just quoted Kierkegaard from Repetition, where Constantine Constantius says, quote, "Repetition is too transcendent for me. I can circumnavigate myself, but I cannot rise above myself. I cannot find the Archimedean point." Note two things, first of all, about these two quotations. Both makes reference to liquid. Kierkegaard's protagonist mentions circumnavigation, and Dorfman mentions fluid. Constantine Constantius complains that he can only boat around himself, as if he were bounded not by a second self or a double, but by a sea. And Dorfman glosses this in a particular way as an acknowledgement of trouble and turbidity. One has to be both a solid and a fluid at the same time to do doubling, at least if you're going to do it through repetition or irony. A mixture of solid and fluid, this is truly trouble, turbid, getrübt sein. It results in a suspension. Here I listen and find a new critical category emerging in the turbidity of the stuff that should be a self. Not the self, but the turbidity is the agent and the receiver of action. So what you find in the murky waters that this book is a transparent container for, beyond its theorizing, is also a list of the many and different and largely incompatible types or modes of doubling. Doubles don't seem to be one thing. There were a lot of doubles in the 19th century, and as the book shows absolutely convincingly, they had different interrelations, different modes and degrees of dependency, different values, positive and negative, evil and good. They'll all have one thing in common, that is, they all contain a threat. And this I want to come back to, the threat of the double. It is wanted for its threat. It isn't enough to say single and double. You have to also say that there's this threat in all the different modes in which they feel differently about one another, whether they're trying to kill one another, whether they're trying to escape from one another, or one from the other, whether they're of different metaphysical ranks, such as life and non-life, psyche and mirror, and so on. No two pairs are doubles for the same reason or in the same way. This alone is a beautiful act of turbidity. Now to the critical formula that runs as a background hum through a century or two of critical writing, and which I think this book tries to shut off. That is, 2 minus 1 is 1. The main question that Kant is shouting is, how can I be one? Imagine Kant shouting, it's a funny image. How can I be one? That presupposes so much. Once the question becomes the raison d'etre for criticism, so much goes unexplored in the terms, I can be one. We should look into the dream that drives it, to be one and not two. But what kind of dream is this? We need to ask where this dream came from, not only why one and not two, but also why not 3 or 4, or why a number, or why a unity, why a determinate being, why a solid, why not a solid and a fluid? Why not a suspension or a suspiration, a self as breath, as the book recommends? The book's secret, this is the contentious claim, is that there's no such thing as a double. I take the hopeful ending to be saying this, that interdependencies of individuals do not have to transit through a double that is threat and promise. An individual can be mediated through a political collective or a historical cline of ancestors and postcessors. Dorfman calls this, quote, accepting one's doubles, unquote, and I endorse this. But I also think they might not then be doubles if the threat is removed. And what has to be accepted is that the dream that they were was a historical accident that became, for some reason, a critical crusade. I have one more paragraph. The critical operation the book refuses is, in a nutshell, this. You posit a 2 so that you can struggle to subtract 1 and be left with 1 untroubled by anything else. This is the critical operation. 2 minus 1 is 1. There's no reason a field of everything should be fashioned in this way. It's a cultural fiction, a strong one, but one among many. Thinking back to Kant, why should there be this doublet, appearances and the thing in itself? Why should there be just two sources for cognition, percept and concept? Why are there not multiple modes of existence? I'm proposing that the double has a purpose. It serves the backward invention of the one. Without the double, no one. Behind this, there's a proto-gesture that remains hidden, and that is the reduction of a multiplicitous field, could call it a field of interference that has no units, that's uncountable, to two, or to sets of twos, and through two to one. True, a double is dangerous to its one, but the threat confirms the one's existence, produces it, nurtures it, allows experience to be turned into a field of units. Philosophy of reflection carries out this operation. Wanting a self, why? It doubles it, so that the critical operation can be a subtraction. The critical operation, this is the thing that Dorfman identifies and mercilessly catalogs. For if we have doubles anywhere, it is in criticism, which includes philosophy, psychoanalysis, some literature, and so on in this period. Doubles are its fantasy, and its job has been to convince us that the field of life is divided this way, so that 2 minus 1 can equal 1. That's it.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to say that if while we are talking, anyone has questions, they can already start putting them in the chat box and we will respond. We'll respond to one of the speakers if it's addressed to one of the speakers at the end. And also at the end, you can obviously ask your question in person if you want to ask it on the video. So there's two options here, more than one. And I'll introduce our next speaker, which is going to be Marina Mayorski, who's a PhD candidate in the Comparative Literature Department and the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies here where I am at the University of Michigan. She has an MA in Comparative Literature from Tel Aviv University, and her MA thesis, which was supervised by Eran Dorfman, discusses identity formation and conceptualizations of foreignness and belonging in the work of Clarice Lispector. Her current research focuses on the study of translation and language politics in early 20th century Jewish literature written in Russian, Hebrew, and Ladino. Thanks for jumping in, Marina.
Can you hear me? Yeah, good. Apparently there's a football game going on, which is always exciting in Ann Arbor. Yeah, so first, thank you so much to Eran for inviting me to participate in this event. I'm really humbled and frankly a little bit nervous by the thought of standing in for Amir Eshel, whose insight I can't presume to replace, but I'll do my best and offer some short comments and reflections. So I first met on, I think it was 2015, the first year of my master's studies, when I enrolled in a graduate seminar titled The Double, Friend or Foe. I remember thinking how different this experience was with this teacher from other seminars. He clearly seemed to meet his students on completely different terms than others in this active pursuit of a question that is both scholarly and personal for him. And his presence, which was just one of this open engagement and collaborative discovery rather than bestowing knowledge already gained and sealed like I felt in so many other seminars. And later in that semester, when Eran emailed me about meeting to discuss something vague about my plans for the near future, I honestly thought I'm about to be reprimanded for all the classes I missed. But to my surprise, he asked me to join a research group to further explore the topic we've been discussing in class. And research group, these words, this combination sounded really enigmatic to me, since research in my mind and writing, those were solitary activities one pursues in the confinement of one's library, and one, in my mind, also much older and wiser than I was at the time. But I can honestly say that that working as a research assistant in what was increasingly this tightly knit group on the project that came to be Double Trouble, it shaped so much of who I am and what I do today. And I'm really deeply grateful for that. So over the next few years, we spent hours each week reading together to try and capture the elusive figure of the double, myself, two other research assistants, and Eran. And looking at this figure of the double and our own doubles that began to take their own place within this unique dynamic. And like the object of our study, I think our own subjectivities were transformed and extended to encompass the multiplicity of ideas and genres and disciplines and of ourselves. And this idea of the double that I think is so central to this book, the double as a bridge to the other, I think it marks its relevance and importance in the current moment we're living. As Maya pointed out, it almost seems premonitory at times. And the book, in ways that mirror its inception and evolution, brings to bear the roles we inhabit as readers and writers, and touching on the core of textual encounter, the work of writing, and also of classroom encounters and the scenes of learning. Our roles as teachers and scholars are here revealed to be crucial with literature and reading and writing as the spheres where the double comes powerfully into play, where this work of bridging of intersubjective symbolization in psychoanalytical terms discussed by Eran takes place, where we are prompted to move beyond initial repulsion triggered by the challenges to our singularity and originality towards an understanding of our inner and outer multiplicities. And we know from the experience of Hans Christian Andersen's Learned Man what might befall us if we were to reject these insights and insist on the confinement of our singularity and try and rid ourselves of our shadows. And this idea becomes even more significant, I think, at this time when we seem once again to be losing our shadows, but not to the dazzling light of enlightenment, but to growing darkness. And so with the realization that Double Trouble offers, that was central to me in my reading, rereading now, of our dependence on others and the gaze of others upon us. I also can't help but think again of the world in the wake of COVID. And as Maya said, it's eerily reminiscent, it's eerily evocative in the discussion of these invisible particles in the air and the problematization of breathing, invisible enemies. But also, I think the world might be looking more and more like Walbeck's Islands now that appearances are becoming strictly virtual and disembodied and subject to the gods of internet speed. And I wonder, I wonder if Eran has any thoughts, what forms does the gaze take on now and how we are transformed by these different ways of being seen. And I also think that maybe the most striking work of doubling in this book to me, most meaningful, is that of Eran himself, the writing of his own life, as discussed here, serving as the double that allowed us to move between disciplinary poles and approach this radical otherness of poetry, for example, or of literature broadly conceived. And this extreme form of intimacy disallows the disengaged reading I might have otherwise practiced when reading texts that foreground theory and philosophy or literary analysis of a 200-year-old text. This proximity is what disarms, at least for me, the hermeneutic gaze of a scholar and summons this expansion of the very carefully delineated borders. And from this, as what we might call an emergent scholar that I am, I learned that the route carved between works of literature and theory can and maybe should also map onto as a mirror image of the self, exactly in its refusal that is so striking here to be grasped and fully demarcated. And I'll end with this notion and say thank you once again for this today and for all the years and for all the for all this meaningful learning, informative learning, and just a lot of fun also. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing these thoughts. And our third speaker, or fourth maybe, counting, is Elisa Marder. She's a professor of French and comparative literature at Emory University. She's a founding member and current interim director of the Emory Psychoanalytic Studies program. Her publications include the books Dead Time, Temporal Disorders in the Wake of Modernity from Stanford Press in 2001, and The Mother in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, Psychoanalysis, Photography, Deconstruction, that came out with Fordham in 2012. She's also edited some journal issues called Time for Baudelaire, for example, in the Yale French Studies, and Literature and Psychoanalysis, Open Questions in the journal Paragraph. Professor Marder's work is situated at the intersection of psychoanalysis, deconstruction, and feminism, and it engages with texts and questions that challenge traditional conceptions of temporality, birth, technology, sexual difference, and the limits of the human. So I'm sure she's going to have a lot to say to Elon's book, and I'll pass it on to her.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? I'm going to read from my screen, so I'm going to lose you, and there'll be no others on my screen. So I don't know if something goes wrong technically, just give a shout or something, Maya. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Eran, for the book. And my thing is a tiny bit long, so I will dive in. It doesn't have a title yet, so we'll see. I have no heir. Eran Dorfman opens his thought-provoking book, Double Trouble, with these haunting words, spoken by the author's father on his deathbed. The father's last words, I have no heir, inspire the son to approach his study of the double via a meditation on breath. As he explains so beautifully in the opening pages of the book's first chapter, the act of breathing troubles the division between the self and its environment by exposing it to what lies outside and beyond its borders. Breath gives life by opening the self to forces it cannot see, hold, or contain. Breathing, Dorfman reminds us, is both active and passive, conscious and automatic, essential for life and essentially beyond the control and grasp of the one whose life it sustains. In Double Trouble, Dorfman argues that, like breath, the double challenges the boundaries between inside and outside. In his book, he explores how the double inhabits literature, philosophy, and psychoanalysis from within and establishes powerful connections between them. In a move that explicitly draws upon Lacan's notion of the mirror stage and implicitly recalls Derrida's notion of the supplement, he shows that the double is not something that happens to an already constituted subject, but rather is there from the start. The double is both the trace of a foundational void within the subject and serves to cover over that primordial absence. Without the double, there is no self. But if there can be no self without a double, it is because the self cannot be self-contained. Neither self-sufficient nor self-identical, the self is inexorably destined to be fragile, vulnerable, dependent on others. Moreover, the double's very capacity to double endows it with a potentially transformative powers. It simultaneously reveals the fissures and limitations at the heart of the self and bridges the divide between the self and the outside world by facilitating the self's ability to tolerate becoming vulnerable, porous, and receptive to others. The book's narrative arc takes the form of an introspective intellectual quest that is instigated by the father's last gasp. The father's last words haunt the son like a ghost. In the words, I have no heir, the son hears a secret message that prompts him to grapple with his father's legacy, by thinking about the double. Quote, "My father's message was pronounced in a few repetitive words, and I have tried to translate them here in my writing," unquote. The book, Double Trouble, is thus explicitly presented to the reader as the author's translation of the secret message transmitted by his father's last words, "I have no heir." Double Trouble is thus written under the sign of translation. The link between the father's last words and the writing of Double Trouble happens through translation, but it also happens in translation. Although the word translation appears only twice, translation haunts the book at every level. At a basic pragmatic level, the book is predicated upon translation, as none of the primary literary or philosophical works treated in Double Trouble was originally written in English, the language of the book itself. The majority of literary works were originally written in French. They are almost always cited uniquely in English translation. But if, as we have already seen, this book about the double is itself presented as a translation of the secret message in the father's last words, it is surely because there is a fundamental connection between the double and translation. The double is a kind of translation, and translation is a kind of a double. The double functions as a bridge between the self and the other by transposing the language of the self into another form, while translation doubles an original text by breathing new life into it as it encounters the otherness of another language. Furthermore, the doubled form of the book's discursive structure, whereby, quote, "each chapter begins with a personal story and an original analysis of a literary work, followed by a theoretical intervention," unquote, is itself an exercise of translation. Because they're written in very different kinds of discursive idioms, one might say that the personal stories translate the literary texts and the theoretical insights and vice versa. Likewise, the author presents the literary works under consideration in his own lively personal voice, rather than relying upon either a more neutral description of the works under consideration or by making extensive use of quotation. As he almost never quotes from the text in the original language, and rarely even quotes from the English translation, his own personalized reconstruction of the literary works functions like a double of both the original French text and the English translation. His voice merges with the literary works he discusses. As a double of the literary work, Dorfman's narrative voice creates a zone of intimacy with the book's reader that constitutes one of this book's many pleasures. At times, these many scarcely perceptible acts of translation also produce some strange and uncanny effects, and one of which concerns the father's famous last words. To an American ear, the words, "I have no heir," have an odd and distinctly foreign ring to them. The expression, "I have no heir," reads like a translation, which of course it almost certainly is. Once the reader thinks about it, it becomes clear that the author's father probably never uttered those words in English. "I have no heir" is, I presume, a translation from the Hebrew. But as the fact of that translation goes unmarked in the book, the odd expression, "I have no heir," starts to produce other doubled meanings. Said aloud, the words, "I have no heir," sound exactly like, "I have no heir," that is, no inheritor, no successor, no beneficiary. And so as I embarked on the book's journey, I found myself wondering how this other double meaning haunts the text of Double Trouble. Because even though the question of the paternal inheritance is posed directly in the book, there is something about what it means to inherit from parents, from history, from the transmission of literary traditions, and from language itself, that while asked by the book, nonetheless remains largely unaddressed in the book. And here I note in passing that there is no mention of the theorist's mother. I invoke the term theorist's mother as a shout out to my friend Andrew Parker, who wrote a book about philosophy and psychoanalysis by that name. In the chapter devoted to Tournier and Welbeck, for example, the reader learns that the author has a sister, And of course, the father's death is presented as the very occasion of the book's birth. The book is dedicated to the memory of the dead father. But what about the human mother? She is strikingly absent both from the personal stories and from the literary works. In most of those literary works, with the exception of the Duras text, the double emerges from within a homosocial drama in which the feminine characters, if there are any, are reduced to relatively minor plot devices. When the figure of the mother does appear via the discussion of Kristeva and the abject, it is not as an actual person, but as an instantiation of an incestuous fantasy about a non-human maternal depicted as an island or a cave within the internal drama of the male subject. I found myself wondering, could there be some connection between the double and the erasure of the human mother, and about the lost language, the mother tongue of the original literary works? Reading Double Trouble inspired me to reread Maupassant's Le Horla, or more precisely, both of Maupassant's Horlas. Because although Dorfman does not mention this fact, Maupassant's Le Horla is not only about a double, it literally is a double. Maupassant published two distinct versions of the story within a year of one another. Despite the fact that both stories share the identical title, Le Horla, and include some images and scenes that recur in nearly identical form, the two stories are also significantly different from one another. The first shorter version of Le Horla, published in 1886, is written in the form of a clinical case history. In the story, a character called Dr. Marina presents the findings of his recent visit to a mental hospital to a fellow group of doctors. The story consists of Dr. Marina's account of a strange encounter with a man in the asylum who claims to have been persecuted by an invisible being of another species that is spreading a contagious form of madness destined to destroy and supplant the human race. The second version, the one treated in Double Trouble, is written in the form of a diary. The two versions double each other in strange ways. Reading them through one another highlights specific details within each story and alters the reading of each one on its own. This doubling effect also destabilizes the possibility of ascribing a fixed meaning to the double within each story. The first Horla ends on a disturbingly ambiguous note. The doctor who treats the case of the man in the asylum is genuinely unable to decide whether or not the man is crazy, whether they are both crazy, or whether, as he puts it, our successor has actually arrived. Je ne sais si cet homme est fou, ou si nous le sommes tous les deux, ou si notre successeur est réellement arrivé. In this version, in other words, there is a genuine doubt about whether the invisible adversary really exists or not. There is no way to know for sure whether the threat comes from within or without. In the version that Dorfman analyzes, the diary form appears to support the view that the diarist is the source of the problem. According to Dorfman's reading, the diarist suffers from a form of toxic narcissism that stems from a failed attempt to protect himself from otherness, which erupts as a violent projection and hallucination that drives him to destroy his home, his servants, and himself. For Dorfman, in other words, the source of the violence can be clearly located. It arises as a reaction to the threat of alterity, and here it does not matter to Dorfman whether the alterity comes from within or not. That is experienced by the self as unbearable. If, however, one takes a closer look at the language of Maupassant's texts, the doubling effects not only undermine the possibility of discerning the difference between the inside and the outside of the self, but also change the very terms of that question. In the diary entry of August 19th, the diarist has a sudden flash of devastating insight after reading a story reported in a scientific journal about an epidemic of madness compared to a plague that arrived via boat from Rio de Janeiro. The diary quotes directly from the scientific journal. In that story, within the story, we read an account of a mysterious plague that causes people to leave their houses, desert their villages, abandon their cultures, because they say that they are being pursued, possessed, and treated like human chattel. The French is bétail humain, by invisible beings. After reading this story, the narrator makes a connection between this account of enslavement and his own earlier sighting of Brazilian three-mast boat. He now believes that the Orla, an invisible being that will destroy and supplant the entire human race, has arrived via the Brazilian boat, and comparing what he knows about the violence that man has historically done to animals with the future violence that the Orla will do to man, he concludes, quote, "The reign of man is over." I do not have time now to examine this passage with the care it deserves. Like a dream image that has undergone condensation, it generates meanings in all directions. Let me just indicate some avenues for reflection. The phrase bétail humain, human chattel, in the context of a story about boats to and from Brazil and the treatment of people like animals, cannot not conjure up the repressed and hidden specter of the slave trade. The narrator's madness, if madness it is, also bears the traces of a guilty and unresolved relation to the traumatic legacy of a past historical reality. In his paranoid fear that the Orla, a new race of invisible beings, will come to enslave him and the race of men, he projects onto the future a distorted version of the repressed and disavowed reality of slavery. In his madness, he communicates and transmits an unbearable truth that he himself neither knows nor understands. The source of the threat comes both from within and from without. It is personal, historical, and political. Moreover, when the narrator announces that, quote, "the reign of man is over," is this merely a defensive and narcissistic expression of madness? Or is the diarist also expressing some truth about the limitations of articulating the relation between the self and its others as a purely anthropomorphic drama? The current pandemic reminds us that there are, in fact, invisible forces with which we must contend. Reading Double Trouble and rereading Maupassant's stories while dealing with the cumulative assault of the pandemic, the current political nightmare, and the effects of climate change, I couldn't help but hear the father's last words, "I have no air," as a double translation of the cry that binds pandemic to politics. I can't breathe. Thank you.
Thank you, Elissa, for that beautiful reading. And we'll now turn finally, to Eran and his comments and responses. And I'd really love also to hear from him about the making of the book, kind of how it came to be structured the way it is. But before that, let me introduce him. Eran Dorfman is Associate Professor and Head of the Department of Literature at Tel Aviv University. He's also a former Program Director at the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris. He is the author of Foundations of the Everyday, Shock, Deferral, Repetition, that came out in 2014, and Learning to See the World Anew, Merleau-Ponty, Facing the Lacanian Mirror, came out with Springer in 2007 in French. And finally, he's the co-editor of Sexuality and Psychoanalysis, Philosophical Criticisms, that appeared with Leuven University Press in 2010. So thank you, Eran.
Thank you very much, Maya, and thank you all for coming here and the audience. I see many familiar faces and friends and colleagues and students. So I'm very moved, so maybe I start with after having thanked Maya and all people who came, also to thank Paul, Elisa, and Marina, and for these very thought-provoking interventions. I will try to answer them, but maybe first I'll say some words about how the book came through, and what Maya, you asked me. So as you heard Marina, it was kind of peculiar experience for me and for my research group. I received a grant from the Israeli Science Foundation, and I had a lot of money, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I decided to give it to students, but to ask in return that we meet weekly and discuss the theme of the double, which started to occupy me. So this group, which was ongoing for about 5 years and included 5 research assistants. We were 3 assistants and me at every given time. So it is Marina Mayorski, Aviatar Copenhagen, Oda Levi, Guy Shapira, and Maya Shvalbo, who are all here, I think. So we discussed, we met, but we started to create together ideas. So it was a very delicate task of doubling, I would say, or creating doubles, because many of the ideas were mine, but then they were echoed in the room, and then they came back to me differently. So we started to develop ideas, but then the question was again what to do with them. So we said maybe we'll have a lexicon of doubles, and thought about maybe Roland Barthes, Les Discours Amoureux, the book where he's creating a lexicon of love. So I said maybe I would create all kinds of terms for doubles. But then, as I recount in the introduction, my father suddenly died, and with these last words, so it would be, I can't breathe, but I really wanted to, Elisa, keep these words as they were said in Hebrew. I have no air or hair, as you so beautifully said. I didn't think about it actually, but it's in the unconscious maybe. So, and then I decided that I needed to do it differently. I decided that I need to make it a much more personal book, and I wanted to start by this death, by this story, and then the structure was revealed to me. I understood that I needed that the double is something which threatens the unicity, as Paul said. 2 minus 1 is 1. That is the idea of the double, but that this idea is also threatened or challenged by double. That is the paradox. So I said I would try to make it like 2 books. Okay, so 2 minus 1 is 1, but it's not 2 minus 1 is 1. It's like 1 and 1 creates multiplicity, or 1 which is not 1. So I wanted to have one part which is more personal and more just free reading of a work. So Elisa talked about Leorla, but there are 3 others works of Hans Christian Andersen, of Marguerite Duras, and of Michel Houellebecq. And also I decided that all the other, there are so many works about doubles, there are so much literature about the doubles, so I would put everything in footnotes rather, and just try to have the essential in the pages of the book themselves. And so this is how this bizarre structure came, and I think it is in many ways because of what happened to me, of my father, and then I went back to my first, my breakup with my first boyfriend, and other things that happened to me, and I decided to double them with theory, with literature, with philosophy, with psychoanalysis. But it is also in many ways the fruit of the way we worked in the research group, which really obliged me to I would say to have a very alive, to very lively spirit of the book. I really tried to maintain the spirit of the group, and also when I tried, when just boring chapters, when I wrote boring paragraphs, I just received remarks from my assistants or my friends, my students, that obliged me to change them. So it's really a work of a common work, and I think that it is there in the pages. Yeah, you can read them in the pages. So I would maybe try to answer some of the questions, because they were very profound, and some of them need to think more in depth, because I think that many things. I think what Elisa said about the mother, or what Paul said about this. Am I for the double or against the double? Is there a double? So it's difficult to answer, but I will try to answer some of the questions. Maya, you said about films of the doubles. There are so many films about doubles. They're like so many of them. So Fight Club and Enemy and Double and some Spider-Man films, and so many of the films show doubles, because I think that in the double there is something of the cinematographic or something about the image. I think that the double and the first chapter is all about the image and Lacan and the mirror stage. There is something about the double which is very narcissistic, and it's about doubling oneself with an image. And the cinema is really the best way to show it, or to create it, or to so the cinema is, it's no coincidence that the cinema is very occupied about its own nature of doubling heroes, doubling the spectator. There are many theories about it. I decided almost not to write about cinema, because I'm not an expert of cinema also, but also because I wanted to maybe narrow myself to writing, to literature, but also because I wanted to get out of this narcissistic endeavor to double oneself with a fixed image. So this is why the book is starting with one double, and then gradually it turns to more and more doubles, or multiplicity of doubles, which are much more, I think, in literature than in cinema. It's very difficult. It is possible, but it's very difficult to have like this multiplicity in cinema. There is something about writing which is more, like I would say, symbolic than imaginary. There is something more multiple. It is doubling of myself in writing, but then it is doubling with words, and words there are so many words, and so in translation, as Elisa so beautifully said, it's translating my thoughts and then sharing it with other people, and then rewriting, and then there is the reading. So some of these are take place in cinema, but I think that in writing we have this multiplicity from the outset more than in films. And about Jeff Wall, about the maybe I'll try to share it. I don't know if I show the screen of the this is the image of the book, and you see here the book. So I hesitated what kind of cover should I have, and I saw some works of Jeff Wall in Tel Aviv Museum, and I wrote to him, and he accepted to give for free this image, and I really like it because it is himself in 79, I think, and he doubles himself, but there is something so natural and uncanny about this image. About, I think it's the gaze. Both of these persons look at us and they say something very different and very similar. And maybe I try to decipher what they're trying to say to us. And maybe also it answers your remark, Elisa. I do think that the problem of the double is more masculine than feminine. So I can say from my perspective, because I'm a man, but also in literature, and there is some research about it, there are much more male doubles and male threats. When they are female, it's less a threat and it's more like a challenge. So I think that there is something, it is a very essentialist claim that I'm saying right now. So, but I think that there is a multiplicity in women, and for men, multiplicity is much more a danger than it is for women. I think this is why for my father it was a threat, for me it was a threat. But I was never a woman, so I cannot say things in the name of others. So maybe we can have a discussion about it. But I do think it is, yeah.
Elisa, would you like to say something in response?
Yeah, I did want to say something, and it's partly to Paul too, because I love your title, by the way. I should have started by saying it's a fantastic title. And Paul talked about the trouble and gave trouble to double trouble. But of course, the title made me think of that you're rewriting the title of Gender Trouble. And that, as I was reading the book, I didn't know what angle I wanted to talk about, but I have to say, and you've got to take the teasing tone, hear this as a teasing tone. Eran, you managed to talk about psychoanalysis without ever once mentioning sexual difference, castration, the phallus, or anything. And this obviously is a choice. But you're making huge claims about subjectivity and a new claim for subject and other relations. So you can't have it both ways. You can't have this concept of the double being the universal and obviously be a choice to displace everything that is founded in psychoanalysis on the problem of sexual difference. And you just eliminate it completely from the book. And I mean, to a point that was kind of astonishing. And then, now you want to say, oh, but it's more masculine than feminine. Oops, I don't know what it's like to be a woman. Whereas at least within psychoanalysis, that is the source of the whole story. So if you take, let's say, the reference to Judith Butler on the one hand, and then the engagement with psychoanalysis on the other hand, I had to tell myself that's a choice. But then I want to see you cash out all of the consequences of that choice. And you can't turn around at the end and go back and say, but I'm just a man.
So thank you for this remark. I would say that for me, the most challenging chapter and the most also important chapter for me is the third chapter about Marguerite Duras. And in this chapter, I think that I really do engage with this question, and what I try to describe. I know that you worked a lot about this work, Le Ravissement de l'Homme Bestein, but I would say that for me it was a chapter of feminization of a man, about becoming a woman in Deleuzian terms. So, and I tried to become this woman in a certain sense, following the narrator of this novel. I found that it was a choice, you're right, it was a choice not to linger on the sexual difference. I do discuss it sometimes in the footnotes, but not in the main chapters, because I thought that if I discuss this in psychoanalytical terms, I would risk in repeating the same things that I try to escape. So it's not an answer, I know, but it was a choice, and I thank you for that. And I would need to continue thinking about it. I totally agree. Maybe I tried to do to Judith Butler a kind of generalization or neutralization of the sexual problem, but I think that it is a question that is really in my heart, and it's something that I do discuss the how to transcend or escape, overcome this masculine obsession with the double, or with a narcissistic double. And so it's not, I know that it's not a complete answer, but it's a beginning of a dialogue maybe that we need to continue in length.
Did you have any further remarks before we open up?
I wanted to say some things about what to respond to what Paul said. It was very puzzling for me to listen to the things, because I really liked it, what you said, Paul. But it also it's like what Elisa said. It's a kind of a challenge for me, because what you're saying is that there is no double. Actually, that's the conclusion of the book, that the double is a fantasy of our culture, in a certain sense. And I think that what I try to say is that the double exists and it does not exist. It exists as a fantasy. It exists as a cultural production. It exists as something which is maybe psychological and psychological product. It's not ontological. But on the other hand, this is why I'm not Deleuzian, because I say that we need to pass through this narcissistic or cultural phenomenon. We cannot just say, no, there is multiplicity, or there is no self, there is no one. But on the other hand, I do not want to duplicate the fantasy of 2 minus 1 is 1. So how not to reassure ourselves that we are one on the one hand, and how not to just say, no, we are not one, we are many from the beginning. So this is why I really try to build this book as a process, an intellectual or personal journey of going from the one, from this 2 minus 1 is 1 maybe, and the failure of that fantasy, and gradually opening oneself, myself, maybe the readers, to multiplicity. So it's very delicate. It was very delicate for me, and to place myself or to locate myself with regard to the question of the double. Is there a double? Is there no double? So this is why I say it exists and it does not exist. So this is why I really sympathize with what you're saying, but I have the impression that you're much more Deleuzian than I am, maybe, but I'm not. Maybe you want to respond. I don't know. I don't know. And just to say something about what Marina said, which was very moving for me. I think worked with Marina for so many years, about the gaze in the area of COVID. And I think that many of you spoke about COVID and the coronavirus and what it made us become. And I would say that the COVID just exposes something that was already there. So in a certain sense, it's like the double. Its aim is to expose something and to tell a secret. But the question is, what would become of us in the end? So because in many of the doppelganger stories, the hero just died because he tries to overcome a double, or it negates a double. So maybe the COVID just came to tell us we are not maybe one, or we have seen these viruses which multiply very fast in politics, in our bodies, everywhere. What would become of us at the end? Is it an initiation story? It's a Bildungsroman that we're living all right now. And who is initiated? Is it us? Is it our ancestors, our heirs, So it's a very big question, and I think that we deal with these questions every day. And I must say that this is where I think that intellectually we're a bit. I'm very confused, because I have the impression that there are many questions that are raised, but the answers may be given much later. So this is where thought is coming later than reality. And this is where intellectual, for me at least, I'm humbled by reality, because I say it's too overwhelming and I don't have much intelligent things to say about it right now, which is very frustrating, but I hope to catch up later, maybe. So, but thank you very much for all these remarks, and some of them critical, some of them sympathetic, but all of them are very, for me, nourishing, and so thank you a lot.
Thank you, Eran. And we do have one question from Chagai Knan, and then anyone else who would like to participate and ask something or make a comment is welcome as well to put your name in the chat.
Hi, I'm Chagi, by the way. Good to be here. I have one comment, but let me first take the opportunity to congratulate Eran for this moment of having the book out and in the public and then in the public debate. And thank you for the wonderful responses of the speakers, very enriching and thought-provoking. I think that one of the themes that, one of the recurring themes this evening had to do with selfhood on the one hand and translation on the other. So selfhood and translation, or selfhood as translation, maybe. And in this context, I just small, maybe linguistic points. First, it occurred to me while you were speaking that the beautiful title of the book, Double Trouble, can be read also by taking the double as an imperative. That is double the trouble, which takes us back. And of course, double can be used to double, and in Hebrew too, the word kaful has also a verb aspect to it. And this can be maybe a key to this Deleuzian picture, which Eran, you mentioned, which allows us to see the double as a multiplicity, and to have plurality into the picture, and not the 2 minus 1 necessarily. I mean, and in this sense, to double the trouble is to say, yes, I have my own troubles, but let's start doubling them. And so that's one point. The other point had to do with Elisha's very beautiful talk, and to her, to the emphasis, the weight you put, Elisa, on the opening sentence of the, as you put it, the author's father. I have no heir. Now, I don't know what the Hebrew sentence is. I could only guess, but I would, and maybe I'm wrong here, but in Hebrew at least, the translation of I have no heir would be en li avir. It's different from I cannot breathe, so I don't know what Eran meant, but en li avir means I have no heir. And I found it really touching that you first noticed that this was a translation. Of course, it's in an obvious way a translation, but something in the language already kind of echoed in a way that the translation dimension was present. And I just want to bring to our attention that in Hebrew, en li avir is an interesting construct, because the I does not appear there. And it's present there, but if you need to, if you must translate it literally, I haven't, probably could do it better than me, but something like there's no air for me, or if you want to be even more literal, completely kind of literal, nothing to me air. That sounds like hieroglyphs almost, but that's how I would read it. And I thought it's interesting that the self here in this structure does not appear in the nominative. And so, and it appears the self, the li is in the dative. It appears as a dative. So the whole construct of selfhood suddenly changes here in this moment. And of course, we know of Levinas's work, in which the human subject, the whole claim is that the ethical subject is the ethical subject in the accusative. The subject is in the accusative because he is under the demand, the moral demand or the ethical demand of the other person, always subjected to it. But kind of it occurred to me that it might be interesting to think of selfhood also in the dative. What does selfhood in the dative means? And the kind of the opening kind of thought was that there's an evacuation of this space of the nominative, the evacuation of the I, and still being a self in some sense. And this also kind of connected me to thoughts about what you said about the relation to pandemic and to different kinds of selfhoods. And I can go on and on, but that's basically what I had to say.
Would you like to respond?
Thank you, Hagi. It's very beautiful. And I think that what you said about the I have no error, or it's the nothing which is in me. And it's really in the spirit of what I tried maybe to translate, as Elisa would say. But it's only upon death, only upon this moment, it's an acknowledgement of this liquidation of the I. It's an acknowledgement of that, maybe of that it's neither the double nor myself who are there, but it's just nothingness. And but what is there? That's also the question. But this is why it's the starting point of the book. But it's from there I tried to see. So what's there? I mean, it's a question. So it's an open question. But maybe Elisa would like to say something. Or...
Okay, we have then, if not, then we have Eviatar Copenhagen who would like to say something.
Hi, good evening, and thank you. I just wanted to say really briefly that working on this book with Eran, which was amazing and an honor, kind of taught me that, teach me that although we sometimes try in academia or in any other profession to fight the emotional or the personal, what I really like about this book is the organic way of the personal fused in the research. And I think that in some way it can be a good kind of direction for some answers to some of the questions that were raised. I think that it was beautiful that that Eran as an author did not see the personal as an enemy, or the personal versus the professional as two kind of divided parts in him. He saw the personal and the professional as a one whole, and I learned a lot from this. And I learned that sometimes it's best saying try to write the truth other than try to write everything down. And that's all. I really like it, and thank you.
Thank you, Eviatar. Eviatar is my double, by the way, so you can see.
Yes, that's very clear. Anybody else? Okay. Does Eran, does anyone or any of the speakers want to say anything in conclusion, or?
Paul, would you like to say something about this? Maybe.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting. There's so much in the book. What I appreciated about the book most of all is that it didn't land on a theory, but worked through all the cases, not even cases of a single affliction. So I think you get there in a way. I appreciate your saying that I'm Deleuzian. It's the first time that ever happened to me, and so it gave me something to think about. I guess I think what interests me in the way you deal with it is that you don't, throughout all of this work, and even in your presentations today, Eran, which are so questioning and self-questioning and careful and tentative. So that's all through the book, and it's really precious, I have to say. Makes it a pleasure to read. Not for people who are looking for the formula, but if you're looking for the phenomenon itself, you really find it there in all of its different guises and details, and it's not really settling into one shape. Yeah, I feel like, I guess what I'm saying is, insofar as it's posed as a problem, and that problem really comes out whether you read Poe, the characterization of the double as a problem, whether you read Poe or Hegel, it's presented as a problem that needs a solution. And this gives all sorts of impetus to the act of criticism. We have to figure this out. Psychoanalysis has all sorts of ways to figure it out, to reconfigure it. And even Lacan goes back to Freud's various doublings and says, well, we need to make this doubling more dialectical in many places. Taking away, I think, some of the other side of the double that you put out very clearly, that it's ambiguous, that it's not a determinate negation. But criticism has wanted it to be something that it has to solve. So my sense is that it's a critical idée fixe. And the way you deal with it opens it up maybe to other names and other processes besides this problem of alterity. I see that going on there. It doesn't have to be some Deleuzian field of multiplicity that I don't understand, I must admit. That substitutes for it necessarily, but it would be interesting to look for names.
I also wanted to say something additional, which you pointed out, Eran, that chapter 3 was really the heart for you. And I felt that way too, actually, when reading it. And I was wondering also about, we focused a lot on your father and the language and what he said in the translation, but also about, we didn't talk that much about the queer narrative that emerged here. And whether that maybe is a partial answer to what Elisa, the problems that Elisa is raising, which for me was kind of a way to enter gender and sexuality in this book, trying to think through what it really meant for me, the otherness as something queer, and that put a different spin on it, I guess, on the double. So I was just thinking out loud as you had this conversation with Elisa, and just thinking and saying now to you that I really appreciated that chapter, especially.
Thank you very much. And I would say once again that this double trouble and the gender trouble, it is because the double is queer. There is something very queer about the double. But once again, I think that I had the impression that if I get into this sexual difference, it would not be queer, or it's something that would not allow me to say something personal. I just didn't have the access to it in a certain sense. I needed to maybe I made shortcuts, maybe I skipped some things, but I had the impression that I just needed to go straight into Duras and becoming woman, man, this process of reading her and identifying with her, just in the middle of breaking out with my partner and my boyfriend at the time. This is maybe my limit as a theorician also. But it was a way for me to remain personal and to say something that was important for me. But then the price was, as Elisa mentioned, was ignoring some very important works about that maybe could inspire me, but I had the impression that I could not find my place there. So once again, it's a avowal of my limitation, I would say.
I don't see any other comments, but I would not end on the note of limitation, personally. I really want to end on the note of enrichment and really how much I've learned, and hope you all, pick up a copy and it's just a beautiful read, and opens up, as Paul also said, and Elisa and Marina, so many ways of thinking about what doubleness is and what the trouble is in this book and the trouble of the double. So thank you everyone for whoever spoke, to Elisa, Paul, Marina, Eran, for your very careful and beautiful comments. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and happy reading and happy Halloween if you celebrate it. There's going to be some ghosts out tonight, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, Maya. Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you, everyone. Congratulations, Ron.
Thank you.